Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Market Talk. We're delighted to be joined today by Oliver Hall, who's the Managing Director of allmanhall, the food procurement specialist, and also Toby Magness, UK Sales Director at Ambach, specialises in premium cooking suites for commercial kitchens. Thank you both for joining us today. Great to see you. Oliver, we'll kick off with you if that's okay. We're obviously hearing at the moment that there are a lot of shortages, delays, logistics issues, particularly in the equipment supply chain. You're obviously coming at this from the food side of things. What sort of pressures are you seeing from that perspective? Does it mirror what a lot of the guys are seeing now on the equipment side?
Yeah, very much so, mirrored in the food supply chain. We've heard about issues through the whole of the supply chain, from inbound logistics to outbound, delivery challenges causing late deliveries and product shortages. So unfortunately it's the same. Yeah, it's very much the same in the food supply chain. I guess with the nature of the service and it being sort of requirement for very regular deliveries, it quickly escalates and snowballs.
Yeah, very, very true. And Toby, coming at it from the equipment side, that sort of chimes with what you're seeing, is it, in the market?
To a point. I mean, there are some materials and components that have been in shorter supply, but we're not into shifting lots of individual appliances. So the design and the lead term process are a lot longer and probably therefore easier to manage in terms of stock control. More recently, I suppose it's because since it's been green lights all the way for the recovery of the industry, everyone wants everything on a shorter time scale. So that's really sort of compressed everything in, and that has its own challenges too. But so far, touch wood, we've been able to rise to the challenge and haven't let anybody down yet.
Good news.
Fingers crossed. Yes, so Toby, obviously everything in England is opening up next week. So in response to that news, have you seen any kind of movement? Have sales of Ambach suites actually increased, or has order or inquiries levels increased?
Definitely inquiry levels and project tender work. That's gone through the roof the last few weeks actually, where the handbrake's been released, and I think a lot of these projects were either parked or cancelled. So we're seeing that accelerate through, and certainly there's a lot of inquiries coming through for new project work, and that's also been the same. That's echoed around the world really. It's not just the UK that's bouncing back. There are other areas of the world that seem to be forging on with the recovery as well. So yeah, our estimating department are working all hours at the moment to try and keep up with demand.
Well, this is positive, but obviously equipment and food itself all needs a good logistical network and supply chain to get it to where it needs to be. So Oliver, just coming back to you, there's been kind of a shortage of HGV drivers reported. So how severe is this, and what can be done to alleviate any pressure that this is causing?
Well, we've seen sort of estimates of anywhere between something like 50,000 and 100,000 shortages of drivers. So, very significant shortages of labour. And I think so far what we understand is sort of it's pointing towards the industry having to resolve it itself. So that's things like increased pay to attract new drivers and retain drivers, improve working conditions, and therefore just all round better schemes to retain and attract drivers, and focusing, I guess, on a domestic workforce as opposed to sort of the European overseas labour workforce. So that's what we're seeing in the marketplace at the moment. So unfortunately, significant shortages.
Yeah, I mean, that's been made even worse from our point of view, because obviously the majority of Italy of the factory shutdowns due, and the whole of Italy goes on holiday. So everybody again wants to concentrate that in and get their deliveries in before the beginning of August. So we just have to manage that in at the moment and pay the extra.
Toby, there had been talk of some factories not shutting down over that period, and I know traditionally they do shut down over the summer holidays, particularly in Southern Europe. But from your perspective, then you think it will sort of continue as it normally does in terms of trying to build that closure period in until things reopen in September?
Yeah, well, it's predominantly about the maintenance of the plant as well as the enforced holiday period. So we just have to manage our manufacturing schedules accordingly and build that in. And transport is a part of that when you're dealing with the UK market.
Yeah, sure. Coming back to you, Oliver, obviously restaurants and caterers, they need clear visibility on food deliveries, and that becomes incredibly difficult when lead times are being stretched in the way they are. What sort of pressures are you seeing on that front at the moment?
Yeah, well, significant pressures in terms of operators having to manage it as sort of with as much agility and flexibility as possible. I think sort of recommendations is to place orders as quickly as possible, as early as possible, so that you get the best chance of sort of booking out stock, etc. And also allows food service suppliers and all suppliers in the supply chain in general to plan as effectively as possible. But that whole thing about remaining kind of as agile and flexible, I think is key, although albeit very difficult in a very busy service environment.
Yeah, so Oliver, I mean, how are you seeing restaurants and caterers reacting to these pressures? Are you seeing any changing patterns of behaviour as they look to protect themselves from these challenges?
I think the sector by nature is very good at well, it's ever changing and ever improving, whether that's from sort of the competition in the marketplace and new entrants or new competitors, new food trends, new legislation. It's always having to kind of evolve and develop. So I think, and even more so over the last 16 months with the pandemic, with going from sort of takeaway and delivery only to outside only, and then sort of restrictions on number of tables or households and table service only, and now sort of from the 19th of July opening up fully. So I think that flexibility and ability to change and continuously improve is key for food service operators to continue to thrive.
Good stuff. So coming back to you, Toby, Ambach has traditionally been associated with kind of high-end 5-star venue installations. So how have those kind of sectors fared throughout this time? And if there has been any dip, and I'm assuming that there would be, are they kind of going back to life now?
Well, luckily Ambach has actually got quite a wide-ranging offer, and it's not just limited to those sort of 5-star restaurants. We do quite a lot in colleges. We do business and industry catering, marine, even pub and restaurant chains. Unfortunately, all of those have been hit, the same as the 5-star restaurants. But as I explained before, the lead time on some of these hotel projects is obviously quite long tail. So they've been in design and construction for many years, and once they've reached that level, they have to continue. The building sites were open throughout the pandemic, albeit on a limited basis on occasion. So we were still able to attend site meetings, design meetings, and undertake installations and deliveries during that period. So I've spent quite a lot of time in London at those sorts of sites. And whilst the volume of sites hasn't been there over the last 18 months in terms of new builds, the quality is. So you'll see probably quite a few new hotels opening in that particular sector over the next few months. Really quite exciting for Ambach and for hopefully for the public too.
Yeah, does the hotel sector to you seem one of the more prominent ones in terms of making investments in kind of bigger kitchens, as it were?
I think so. I think there's that level of commitment there to the UK, not just hospitality but the tourism trade, and they're getting themselves ready to reopen when the country reopens. The pandemic has almost been a blip in that sort of process because it takes so long. And as I said, there continues to be building projects ongoing, and I've got projects in design that are due for tender and delivery later next year. So whilst there has been perhaps a reduced number of openings, I still think the machinery is moving in the background to continue to design and develop the hotel offer, particularly in London, but throughout the country.
Yeah, would you say the pandemic has altered the type of, say, cooking equipment and styles of cooking equipment that operators are looking for with these bigger projects?
That's an interesting one, and I've always considered space to be a premium, particularly when you're in London, and the kitchen seems to be getting smaller and smaller, and the dining spaces and the retail areas larger and larger. I don't know if I've seen a shift in that sort of design element. They're incorporating greater space, I think, for sort of COVID safety and and additional sanitizing equipment, and you see the development of those in the market as well. So whilst that's, I think all of those things will come together, and no doubt kitchen design will change in the future. But as things stand right now, I don't see a huge amount of difference.
Rightio. Okay, so coming back to Oliver, I mean, you guys at allmanhall, you monitor food prices very closely. So what trends are you seeing at the moment on that side of things, and which food items are most likely to be affected by price fluctuations in the second half of this year?
Yeah, sure. So unfortunately, it's only going one way, and that's up. Obviously, it's quite well documented in national media about inflation in general, but food inflation is significant already. And the UN's Food and Agricultural Organization is showing about 34% increase in the last 12 months, and that's higher than 2019 and 2018. So it's not just sort of a readjustment after COVID, unfortunately. I suppose the key commodities, all the main commodities, the 5 key commodities are increasing in price at the moment, and that's so the vegetable oil, cereals, dairy, meat, and sugar are all increasing, and we're currently at levels nearly as sort of seen in 2011, which was a 60-year high. So that's it's obviously very concerning that they're about as high as they've been for the last 60 years, and forecasts are set to continue that way, unfortunately.
Oh gosh. So I mean, what sort of impact has the pandemic had on procurement in the food service sector in general then? Are restaurants and caterers looking at procurement through a different set of eyes now?
I think there's been initially, to begin with, there's rationalisation of offer, and there had to be, and ensure that it was it was COVID secure and COVID safe, and with at times a reduced workforce, then the offer had to streamline and become, I suppose, easier to produce. Greater grab and go style, obviously, when people can dine in. So those types of food offering has changed, and therefore the procurement and purchase mix related to that has had to change. I think sort of food operators have probably sort of realised that the communication is key with the supply chain to understand where the challenges are, and where things may be short, or there may be future price increases. So I think that's something that will continue to increase that sort of level of communication and working as closely together as possible, so that issues are mitigated. And obviously there's been a much greater, or continues to be a key focus on GP budgets and margin.
And as a procurement specialist and consultancy, Oliver, how has all of this impacted you as a business? Have you had to change things in terms of your day-to-day offering?
We were obviously working with our clients. They've required a slightly different sort of set of services, if you like, but our core offering has remained, and I suppose, like the food operators, we have to be agile to meet their needs. So focusing on PPE and understanding how the new types of things that need to be procured, and the supply chain to get them to our customers. So in terms of that, we've continued to evolve what we do and how we do it, so that we can meet our client needs as they continue out of the pandemic and reopen.
Yeah, sure. And Toby, just coming to you, it's quite interesting. I wrote a story today actually on somebody who runs a takeaway business, talking about how they've not been able to invest in equipment, or decided not to invest in new equipment because of this increase in food prices. And they'd absorbed those prices, and that had obviously impacted their profitability and their ability to then invest in new kit for their kitchen. I just wondered if those are conversations that you're now sort of privy to and hearing, Toby, from your...
Absolutely, and I've been hearing that from the get-go. The purse strings were really wrapped up tightly for a long period of time, but this is a perfect storm, isn't it, of rising food prices, of staff costs, even things like energy and equipment costs. Everything seems to be heading upwards, unfortunately. So in terms of budgets, I think people are managing it on a sort of hand-to-mouth basis, and unless an appliance breaks down, the likelihood of them replacing it, rather than trying to get it back up and running again, spending a few pounds on spare parts and things like that, that's more likely to happen. So the one-off replacement market has taken a bit of a hit, but that's not necessarily, again, what we do. I guess I haven't really noticed the impact in terms of sales figures.
Okay.
Rightio. Well, Toby, you mentioned earlier about some big projects going on. One that we know that you guys recently were involved in was in the Nobu Hotel in Portman Square in London. So can you just give me a little bit of an idea of how you got involved and what that project entailed for Ambach?
Well, we were dealing with Nobu in Park Lane, which has been there for quite some time, and we were in discussion with the chef team and the maintenance team about developing a new type of tempura fry for them. And we were then approached by Graham Barry Design, who had the general arrangement layouts for the new hotel to be opened. So we were engaged with them. We come up with some highline designs and some budget proposals back in 2019. That then went out through the tender process, and the restaurant finally opened after first lockdown. It was open for, I think, a period of about 4 weeks before it was promptly closed again. So there hasn't been as much of a fanfare as I'd like to see with a hotel and restaurant of that quality. But it was a fantastic project to be designed with, and the guys at Barclay Projects really did a fantastic job in pulling it all together.
Good stuff. And you mentioned a little bit about product development there. So is there anything that you can kind of tease us with as to Ambach's product development going forwards?
Yeah, well, the new tempura fryer is available, and that's for obviously a particular market segment. But again, during lockdown, the R&D team have been quite busy, filling their time playing around with new components and technology. And so we've got the tempura fryer, we've got a new electric char grill. We've made some tweaks to some of the other components like our touchscreen wrap pans and things like that. So there's enough out there to be talking to the chefs and the consultants and the kitchen contractors, and enough for us to be excited about from an Ambach perspective, yeah, for sure.
And how are things in the factory, Toby? Are they sort of back up to full capacity now, or is that essentially affected by what's going on in other markets?
Very much so. As I said before, everything's been concertinaed in these last few months to try and get projects over the line and out of the factory gates. So particularly on a worldwide basis, the factory's been running at nearly full capacity, and with the impending factory shutdown in August, things are the pressure's ramped up. The order book is full, the factory's full, and so we seem to be making all the right things at the moment.
Excellent. Okay. And then Oliver, just to return to you and obviously this issue of the food prices in particular. I guess the knock-on effect of all of this is that it's going to be more expensive for people to eat out, because operators are going to have to add that cost into their pricing somewhere down the line. Is that the kind of conversation that you're having now with operators when they're looking at how they can manage their way through this?
Yeah, exactly right. So if there's greater wages to be paid for retention of drivers, etc., and food supply chain operators throughout, then that will have to flow through to food pricing. So I think there's only one way that it's going to go, as well as raw commodity price increases. So there's going to be sort of a double whammy there, where there's a number of input price increases that are going to mean that the end result of food price increases for operators in the marketplace, unfortunately.
Yeah.
And how much of those costs do you think operators are able to absorb themselves? Is it a kind of razor thin in terms of redundancy in the system?
I think invariably there are always GP expectations, so margin targets. So they will get passed on to the consumer where possible. Where it's more of a consumption-based or budget-based client and operator, then that will be challenging, obviously, to come within budgets. But budgets over the year will no doubt increase based on the food costs increasing over time.
Oh gosh. Okay, well we're nearing the end now, but we'll do the same question to both of you, but obviously from the different angles. So, Oliver, how do you feel the industry is going to cope for the rest of this year? And what do you see in the next 6 months?
I think from a demand perspective, it's going to be very positive. A lot of pent-up demand there, and I've seen data say that there was 1 week in May that was bookings and walk-ins were 80% higher than they were in 2019. So there's been significant increase in demand, as I suppose been well documented. I think the challenge is going to be the supply and making sure that we've got the labour force throughout the supply chain to enable that demand to be met. But optimistic.
Fingers crossed. And Toby, the same to you from the equipment side of things. How do you think the industry is going to fare in the next few months?
Well, I'm hopeful that the operators will have confidence and that there is no further issue with lockdown or restrictions in terms of eating and drinking and entertainment. So I would hope then that would lead to any of the projects that were on ice over this period to have been reopened and restart. But the issue, I guess, then is whether they've got the equipment that's available on the timescales that they want it to. So that represents a challenge to the kitchen contractors and the manufacturers, really, to make sure that they've got the stock in place and ready to go for when the industry restarts in earnest.
Fingers crossed it does. So we have come to the end of our time together this week. So thank you very much, Oliver. Thank you very much, Toby. And join us again next time for another episode of Market Talk.